Hey, Daniel, good morning.
Hey Reed, how's it going?
Oh, doing pretty well. It's another Friday. How's your day? Or this would be your Saturday morning, yeah? Early
Yeah, the
Saturday
day is
morning.
just beginning. Yeah, the day is just beginning. It is pitch black outside. It's currently about what, 6 a.m. I think.
Yep. Yeah, I
So nice
appreciate you
early
for.
start to the weekend.
Yeah, I just I wanted to say that I appreciate you coming on so early on a Saturday. But like I'm really excited for some of the stuff we're gonna go over related to custom visuals and everything else in Charticulator. For the people tuning in, I do want to just give a couple logistic things. As we go through this, feel free to drop questions into the chat window. It's helpful if you can start it with a Q just to make it very clear this is something you'd want me to either answer myself or pass on to Daniel and have a discussion on. And I'll just make sure to do all of that. Otherwise, yeah, like Daniel, I know we've definitely had a lot of conversations and in group chats and everything else on like some of the Slack channels we've been in. I know you're it's how long ago now exactly did you get your MVP?
It was last year around April, so I guess yeah, about nearly a year ago now.
Okay, yeah, so you're due soon for the next chip as well to go on that to start stacking them up and everything, you
Yeah,
know?
it'll be really cool to have an extra little chip on there.
Yeah, I'm
So,
still keep my fingers crossed that sometime in the in the near future we'll both be able to actually meet at the MVP summit if they ever have that in person again, you know. But that's it's a pipe dream that we can have at least. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's we get to meet some amazing people. The world has created some interesting logistical challenges. Um, let's hope.
uh, but yeah, just for a bit of summary of like at least well, what I've been familiar with a lot of the stuff that you've done is like you swim in the pool of custom visuals. Like that's like of anybody that I know, like you that is you're probably the most specialized in it. I mean, certainly a lot of what you've even done to even get an MVP award clearly shows testament to the level of skills that you've had in that space within Power BI. And I that's one of the things that I really wanted to bring on because I've for a long time I've supported custom visuals very much and encouraged them. I've also been making sure that people are aware that there will always be a slight performance impact just because of the security siloing that they have to have for rendering in a browser. But as long as you like maybe only add a couple per page at most, and not necessarily coat your entire page in custom visuals, you will never hit any kind of performance impact. I've seen in rare occasions somebody's like, "Ooh, I just like everything, but like OK Viz, I'm just going to put all of their visuals on my page, and why does this take 15 seconds to load every time I render my browser?"
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've done that.
exactly. But yeah, they 100% have their places for it. It's just one of those, it's a balance between the two. Use native visuals as much as possible, and then for those unique business scenarios or a customer that wants a really specific look and feel, custom visual, or especially the one that we're about to see, Charticulator, are great ways to do that. And I think there's pros and cons to both paying for like a developer to build one out with a really like a really customized one with a ton of features, but for very basic ones, it's actually something that can be built extremely easily with the tool that you want to show me. So I think that
Yeah,
prefaces a little bit of what we're going to go over today. But I want to give you a chance to also give a bit of an introduction about yourself, and then maybe some of your thoughts of Charticulator and everything.
yeah, absolutely. So I think I love what you said. I'd agree with. I mean, I personally really love custom visuals. I didn't really get into them until maybe about three and a half years ago, after wanting to rely on core visuals as much as possible. And I think that's a really good piece of advice. The visuals themselves are, obviously visuals that are frequently used. A lot of them are best practice, with the exception of pie charts, but we won't go there. Um, but generally, you can tell most stories with those visuals very, very well. They're obviously very polished, they're very performant. And I think one of the key things is that in the custom visuals domain, a lot of the perceptions around performance and security and those kind of things are typically around the fact that it takes a lot of effort to build a visual that is of the same quality as a core visual. I come from a multifaceted background, so a lot of my early career was spent in things like QA, so quality assurance testing,
Hmm.
and a lot of that was performance testing. So a lot of my work now as a developer is to perhaps not prematurely optimize, but the visuals that I publish to the store and visuals I produce for my customers, obviously, depending on budget and various other things. We always put a lot of time into making sure that things are responsive and fast. as much as we can, given the frameworks that we have to work with. But going back again to what you were saying, building a good custom visual is expensive. They are software development projects. So a lot of conversations I have with people are, can you build me this visual? Often I can, but it takes a lot of work to polish it up to the point where, oh, it has to do this, it has to have animations, it has to be resizable to the nth degree.
Yeah.
That can all be done, but it comes at a cost. And often that's quite a turnoff for people, understandably so. And often directing people back to core visuals is a good call, and then Charticulator fills a good gap.
I completely agree, and I think you just hit on some of those like primary ones versus like small extra features, which are those nice little polished things that native visuals have. And I mean, I actually just built one recently for a client where they wanted a really interesting kind of combo bar chart where they wanted the bars, but they also wanted a percentage kind of box at the base of each one of those, and like it's kind of basically a stacked visual. And I could have probably figured out some way to layer visuals together to get an effect, but I used a custom visual to build that, Charticulator, stumbled around it a bit, figured it out. But then they were like, all right, well, but the data labels, if it doesn't fit, we want it to like automatically disappear too. Okay, that's going to require a lot more code and probably above my pay grade on it. So like that's a native visual feature. That's really, like, you went from a simple task to now a very complex coding task that has to scale and figure out size and everything else, and determine if this should be visible or not. And that I don't know if you've ever done that in Charticulator, but I certainly know that I immediately started to try to look at the code to do that. Like, nope, that's going to be really complicated and a lot of hours. And they're like, you know what, it's fine. Actually, we don't need it, considering it's probably going to take you a day or two to minimum of build time to do this.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things. I mean, I've got a slide on this. Well, I call it a slide, but a section in a few minutes that we'll talk about with regards to that. But Charticulator is definitely it's a no-code solution. So the things you might want to do around interactivity or special cases that do require knowledge of development, it's perhaps not the best choice for that. But considering how quick it is for you to just, I mean, they've got the philosophy right, to knock something up quick, to do it with minimum keystrokes that you can repeatedly edit and iterate with is pretty good. And that's the trade-off with, with code, you have control over pretty much everything. With, the clicky draggy droppy stuff, then there is a trade-off, and that's one of the unfortunate challenges.
I just want to just do a quick name drop because you mentioned clicky draggy droppy. Christian Wade, I actually did. I asked him, and he will be coming on in a couple of months, also to do a webinar. So I was very happy to get Mr. Wade onto my channel. But you were saying?
I was trying to explain to my wife that that's a real term when I was putting this presentation together.
Oh no, there's t-shirts. There's t-shirts with clicky draggy droppy. It's great. Like I think I'm really hoping that was unplanned. I actually am going to ask him about that. Did you just say that on the spot, or did you kind of think of what's a silly way to describe this? And like, was that something you thought up prior to the talk?
I don't know, but it's a real kind of watershed moment in the description of the BI landscape that we live in. I think it sums it up pretty well.
I agree.
Absolutely.
All right.
Where was I? No, I think we can draw a line into my last bit. That's all good. I was just trying to think, was there anything else? No.
And I will say, like, I would mostly agree with the no code part. It's like you don't actually do any hardcore coding, but you do format coding. Like in the equivalent of, you need to know the format codes like you would in Excel, but it's I should know this. Like the language is escaping me, but it's not anything that if you're familiar with Excel or other stuff, you still will have to learn somewhat. Like the new, it's like a common platform. What is the language that's used in Charticulator again?
There's kind of an expression language which utilizes some parts of D3, which is
thank you. That's what it was.
A lot of us use to build visuals from scratch, and that's become quite common amongst developers for things like number formatting and calculations and stuff. It's fairly intuitive, but again, it's getting into what you got to kind of think about with visuals is, with get and transform in Power BI, you have M, which is kind of a best of breed approach to doing data transformations. So whilst you got the UI in Power BI, you can dig into the code and start writing M code that manipulates things perhaps a little bit more efficiently than if you were to build things step by step. But that's, again, the trade-off. with the analytical side of things, you have DAX, which is a fantastic language in that domain. And obviously you can do things in there that you may not be able to do in M. With visuals, there's almost a language of its own. And we actually have a whole field of, visual theory is huge. And there are people that, I'm a real newbie at it if I compare myself to other people. There's what we call the grammar of graphics, which is a way that we think about building visuals up. There's a common language that we use when putting visuals together. We're not going to dwell too much on that today because that's quite a big topic. But similar to that, when we build visuals, there are tools that we've got used to in this domain, and D3 is a huge one of those. And D3 has a lot of libraries that we can use, and Charticulator uses those. So things like number formatting, and those calculations, you'll see things that don't look familiar, and that's what that is. But there's a lot of help around on the web if you are handy with your favorite search engine.
Yeah, that might be one thing that'll put in the description a little bit later. Is I don't think there's a button that I saw, at least in the Power BI tips version of Charticulator, where you could click it. That it would be nice if there was almost a curious about how to format. Click here to go to a glossary. I did eventually search one and find it, but I might include that. They're pretty straightforward. Anything that you'd want to do, like I want to show currency. There's this thing. Just put this. Here is the blob of formatting code you need for it. So the repository is out there for how to do 99% of your formatting is basically already in there. So that's about most of what you need to do. But
I don't have it to hand currently, and annoyingly,
I'll look it up during a demo.
Presentation. No, I was going to say I do have it if needs be. I just need to pull it out. So
once we get into the demo, I'll just look it up and pop it into the chat window. So
no problems. If you do struggle, I do have it, and I can pass it on after this.
Cool. Do you want to go ahead and get started with the demo?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let me flip over to that. There we are.
Yeah, okay. So hopefully we've got Power BI visible. It looks like we do, so that's good. So a little bit about me. Here's some lovely details. So just in case we didn't cover any of this stuff, I'm an MVP based out of New Zealand. I have my own little company called Kochuba. We basically build custom visuals on a fairly boutique, bespoke basis. But I also do a lot of work for DiscoverEI, who headed by another MVP, Alice Drummond and Christian Borbeck, and they're based in Australia. We do a lot of environmental science stuff and mostly all kinds of Power BI related things.
Alice is great.
Alice is really, really good.
I love to be on. I guessed on one of her little, almost like shop top things that she did last year, and she'll actually be on in a couple of months. So I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent.
All of you guys, I think, have really cool impacts with some of the nature preservation of water work that you guys have done, and you're just all you seem to be very, very fun group of people in general.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm definitely the outsider in terms of the environmental knowledge. I'm bringing the BI stuff, and I'm catching up quite a lot, which is quite good. But in terms of what I do community-wise, I like to create visuals, and I have a number in the App Store. So there's this fella here, which is what we call the small multiple line chart. So Microsoft have finally caught up and are starting to make this thing redundant, but this is the ability to have a single visual with multiple faceted visuals. So this one is a line chart. Another one I have is this one, which until recently was quite nicely featured in Microsoft materials, but it seems to have silently shuffled off, which is a bit of a shame. This is what's known as the violin plot. So this is used to plot distribution statistics like a box plot, but it actually provides a modality, i.e. the shape of your data. So this is a graph of temperature distribution by city in New Zealand, which is quite good. And the other one I have in the store at the minute is masquerading up here, which is known as HTML content. So this is a visual that's built using HTML code as a measure, and it gets rendered rather nicely. So these things here are all clickable.
I think it was there you go. Yep.
There we go. So you can build little cards, and some people have done some incredible things. Actually, Power BI Tips have posted one this morning from an analyst out in Australia called Kerry Kolosko, who has built a little dice game using it, which is all animated and there's all kinds of crazy random stuff. So I would encourage you to check that out.
And anything basically, because it's rendering an HTML box, like anything that in the HTML you build to be clickable would be clickable then in the box, right? To a degree?
You have to you've got to put the yards in, so it's not just magically. Again,
Well, of
it doesn't.
course.
We don't abstract a lot of that away. And the one thing this one does that previous ones didn't do was the linking. So links didn't used to work in older ones. So if you've got a hyperlink that will, custom visuals don't just arbitrarily redirect you; they're not allowed. But we do allow, with consent, to navigate off to domains. Um, there are some people doing some really smart things. Trying to think of I think it's Jefferson Alvarez on LinkedIn. He's doing some amazing stuff with building whole charts in it, which is really fascinating. Animated visuals and all kinds of stuff. So this is the beautiful thing about what I like is visuals that help people to build things better.
Hmm.
So there are some people that are infinitely more creative than myself, and it's great seeing that happen. So we're giving people these little, these extra little bits of control or tooling that they could use to elevate themselves and demonstrate themselves and produce some amazing things for the community, which is fantastic. Speaking
Yep.
of which,
And
oh,
I will
sorry, go on.
say too, is just like your HTML viewer, like if I was to make this page, like, I would actually have more than likely like 5 different little, maybe if I was being clever, I would create a single image that was all of them, up and down to reduce the number on it. But usually most people would probably have 5 separate images added to the page, and then usually probably 5 text boxes. So there'd be a ton of extra visuals getting added. It would look the same, but as you know, the performance impact of more objects you
Yeah,
have, the longer it takes to render. So one nice thing about
that's right.
that is when you have a sandbox of, you can basically create something that rather than this isn't just a screenshot of that, which I've also seen other people do sometimes, but then the scaling sometimes makes it a little fuzzy. You can't click on the links. So it is nice to consolidate even a bunch of 15 native visuals into one custom visual. That custom visual will definitely render faster. So like there's some times where a custom visual will actually make your report page faster because you're removing the number of unique
Yeah.
objects on the page.
Case in point would be this one here. So this is a single visual with a single query. And
Yeah.
this is one of the beautiful things about Microsoft bringing small multiples in is it, when you wanted to have multiple line charts or bar charts, each one of those was a single query. So now this is it's a single DAX query, runs once, and keeps the performance down. So, very correct read, multiple visuals, and even anything, text boxes, buttons, images, it all puts a load on
Yeah.
the browser. And that's a cool thing about doing things yourself or getting a little bit more knowledge in there. Obviously, the clicky draggy grubby stuff is great for getting started, and there's some amazing things you can do with it. And that's one of the amazing things about being in the space we're in. This, I mean, just looking at what Kane was doing on your video the other day, crazy awesome stuff with calculation groups to do really good things with visuals that you just typically can't do. And my brain goes, "Ooh, I need to do a custom visual for that." He's bending the reality of DAX and using it in a really cool way to produce awesome visuals. Anyway, I shall continue onwards. So we've covered a little bit about Charticulator today, but just to kind of build out the landscape a little bit, this is actually built with Charticulator. This is a really simple chart, and what we have over here is almost like a spectrum of preference, right? So over on the left here, we've got the stuff that we really want to have, and the stuff that we ideally want to try and avoid in terms of productivity. So if we dig out the bookmarks. So to begin with, core visuals are probably right at the top here. So the left is better, for lack of a better word. So core visuals are really good. Beyond that, the next kind of preference we have is, custom visuals. Are you consuming them? So these are things that have already been built by other people. And like most people, this is generally how I like to work. I'll do as much as I can with a core visual, and then I'll look for a custom visual that does what I want. And then to the extreme, you've got the option of developing a custom visual yourself. So we have that, right at the other end here. So that comes with its own set of skills and learning and challenges. So you kind of want to avoid that as much as you possibly can. Moving further to the left, we've got tools like the R and Python visuals. So, R and Python are great because they do abstract a lot of functionality. So, there's a little bit of coding required, but there are full libraries available, and a lot of them are packaged in with Power BI as an ecosystem. So you can use libraries like Plotly or Seaborn to build visuals very quickly. Right on the middle is something that I'd love to come back and talk about maybe another day, and I'm going to present this at the Power BI Summit, is a visualization It's actually a custom visual that I'm working on called Deneb, which is a way of building visuals using JSON inside Power BI, and that will allow you to do some very complex stuff with it's verging on code, but it's kind of right on the brink, and it may verge this way over time. But for now, this is where it's sitting. But this is something that I'm quite excited about. But we won't worry about that now. And then finally, somewhere between here and here is Charticulator. So we've got a couple of links here, and obviously I'm happy to share the workbook that I've got, and I've got a whole bunch of examples that I'll perhaps need to have a chat with you about making available to any viewers.
Yep, easy enough for me to add that to a file section and put that in the description. That way anybody watching later on can go download it.
Wonderful. I like to have like, I wouldn't say I'm like Batman level prepared, but I like to have everything ready. So all the stuff we've got today, at least everything that stays within the script is available for you to look at. So anything I build, whether we get the finished version or not, I've got the finished version that people could use to download and explore if they're curious. But Charticulator is pretty cool if you want to stay in this part of the chart, which is really good. So there's a couple places you can get it. We have charticulator.com, which is Microsoft's website. And we also have the Power BI Tips guys have got the kind of what we say the latest stable version of version 1 of Charticulator on their website, which is charts.powerbi.tips.
Yep.
And Microsoft also make it available on GitHub. So the Charticulator is open source, and you can actually download that and build it locally. And that's usually what I do. And what I like about that is because I'm able to see the latest version before it gets published, or, you know, it's not like it's a secret thing or anything. It's just they don't always publish the latest code until they're happy with it. So, but it does mean that if features are trickling out, you can have a look at it on your machine. And what's cool is that, you know, and I did this week, is I was able to fix a bug and push it in, and now I get a little contributor credit, which is kind of awesome. So I'm now in the repository as somebody that actually does a little bit of development on there, but honestly, it's like a teeny tiny bug. But anyway, let's move over to the browser.
Yeah,
so
well,
charticulator.com.
I was just going to say, and we'll probably, and sure, talk more in length about some of the differences between the two versions too. It's definitely was, as we've discussed, you know, a couple weeks ago. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of a situation at the moment.
Yeah, I'm actually going to use the brand new one today,
Okay.
which it's not been announced. I'll get onto that in just a sec. So we'll just look at the website first.
Perfect.
Actually, and I found out by accident, but anyway, we'll talk about it in a sec. So charticulator.com is typically where you would start. So you've got the ability to launch the tool, which we'll just do in a second. There's a little bit of fluff and information around it in terms of what you can actually do with it. Some examples. So this is like your standard kind of landing page. There's a gallery here that the team have made available, which shows some examples. And these examples also, a lot of them have videos that show you how to build them. So this is kind of showing you the kind of things you can create.
I've always wondered why they don't provide like the files for you to, or like, you know, it almost like you could open it and then modify it, or just kind of use it as is.
Yeah, well, today this guy will provide you the files he's produced, I promise.
Oh yeah, yeah. For you, it's great. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I admit there's a challenge here where you have to sort of you watch the video, and then you kind of like, you've got the video open in one tab, and you kind of like, then you got to find a data set as well. The data sets are in the GitHub repository, or links to them are, but it does add to the barrier a little bit. And this is
fair.
This is perhaps what might put a lot of people off. There's a brief intro about how to get started. So this is like again, you can read between the lines with a lot of this, but some of it is exploration. And again, that does push the barrier out. What is probably worth mentioning, though, is this is a tool that's actually built by Microsoft Research. So it's not really, what I would say is it's not like it's a product, but it's perhaps not being fully marketed and pushed. So it's a really amazing tool. There's some fantastic people working on it. You know, you've got Stephen Drucker, you've got Dan Marshall at Bongshin. She's looking after the whole thing. She's doing amazing stuff. All of these people are just brilliant, brilliant minds. And there's some white papers here that explain how it comes around. And it truly is, you know, from a usability perspective, it's really getting better. But what it's doing technically is quite incredible. But anyway, it's the usability that we've really got to focus on. So in terms of we can just click the launch button here or here, and this will open up the app. So yeah, what I was planning to do was the version that's been hosted here has been a little bit in flux. So the version that's published on charts.powerbi.tips, let's just get rid of that. That's a bit of a spoiler. Looks like this. And this is the latest stable version, which is 1.4. And for a while, they've been developing it away and really building it up. So the thing with Charticulator is it's first and foremost a tool for building visualizations, and we call them bespoke visualizations. And the thing with bespoke visualizations is, they're typically very, very centered around a particular theme or use case. So it's perhaps not the best tool if you want to build a generic visual. And actually, the challenge with building a good visual that works generically is everyone's got a different idea about how that visual should work. So the benefit of Charticulator is you come into it with the mindset of, I need to visualize a particular set of data or scenarios, and I can tailor that to my will. And Charticulator started out as a tool that did this for the web. So you would produce images or web pages. And then at some point, I don't know how it happened, but somebody kind of went, this would be really cool if we could make this work in Power BI. So you've got the core app of Charticulator, but then there's this thing that plugs in on top of it. It has an ecosystem for plugins. And there's like a Power BI export thing. So what often has happened over the years is a lot of the core functionality of Charticulator works really well if you're pushing it out to an image or a web page, because it appears as is. But then in Power BI, it perhaps didn't quite correlate one-to-one. And going back to what we said at the beginning, building a good custom visual requires a lot of effort. So what's been happening over the last little while is, as more people have started using it, as more use cases have become apparent, they've started to refine this plugin, and they've started to build a little bit more into the core app that correlates with Power BI.
Yep.
So there's a lot of stuff that just worked kind of magically, but also didn't quite work that reliably. And what I would say is you do often have to exercise a little bit of trial and error. Agreed. So it's a fantastic tool, but its primary use case is for publication to the web, where visuals are typically a certain size and the data is typically static. With Power BI, you then introduce things like, I might resize the visual, I've got to change the data and filter and slice and dice. So there's all kinds of things you have to think about with building it. So the trade-offs, again, are you've got this amazing UI that lets you build visuals really quickly, but at the same time, the changeability of your data inside Power BI can affect how that looks. So it's often about building it, testing it, and seeing how it goes. Anyway, this version here is what we would call the last stable version of version 1. It has pretty good functionality, and I've done a lot of my blog posts using the Power BI tips version. What's happened in the last week, and I've been testing this on my machine locally, is that version 2 has gone live, and it literally went live this week. I mean, when you and I caught up, Reed, it wasn't there, and then it magically appeared one day. So I'm like, oh, this is live now, awesome. So the reality is we have a slightly different looking UI. So if we compare this with this, it's a little bit different, but there's a lot more functionality in here. So I can't sort of dwell on the differences too much between version 1 and version 2. But what I would say is if you're interested in building visuals for Power BI, there's a lot more stuff in here that you'll be able to use. So this version here, the exports work quite reliably, but you don't have a lot of ability to change things once you've built the visual. In this version, they've put more stuff in the export so that when you get it into Power BI, you can configure a lot more without having to go back in here, which is really good.
So yeah, I've appreciated the number of formatting features now available. Like everything from like the text size to the color, like pretty much everything outside of, I think sizing the object in the page, you really kind of had to go back and edit in the custom visual. Now almost, it seems like the few I've built out here, the majority of these attributes that aren't like, where does the bar sit? They're actually like adjustable things in Charticulator. They can be, most of them seem to pass through, which actually even further gives further justification to giving them friendly names. But I've appreciated, like you just said, how much more comes through, so that can be tweaked later without having to continuously come back and make another version of the custom visual. Because then you almost go into like the versioning hell, where it's constant. You have like so many, because every time they just the smallest tweak requires a new custom visual each time.
It does, yeah. And I think that's one of the behind the scenes things is that custom visuals have what they call a GUID. So if you're familiar with the concept of globally unique ID or a
Hmm.
GUID, is in order to prevent other people from having the same ID, they kind of randomly generate them. So when we build a custom visual from a development perspective, we get an ID for that, and that ID is what keeps that visual consistent throughout the app store. So if I push an update, then that ID remains consistent. And what it means is if people find my visual online and it's an older version, and they load it into their report, and if it's in the store, it always pulls the new one down. With Charticulator, they kind of take an approach of every export is a new visual. So what that means is if you're iterating quickly, you can end up with about 5 or 6 separate visual files that all show up in your report. So that's something
Yeah.
you have to be a little mindful of. But what we'll do is, because I don't think I timed this out, but obviously the reality of talking and back and forth means that we may not be able to cover heaps today. So what I have done is I've prepared a Power BI desktop file, which we'll pass on, and a few examples down here. So what I'll do is I'll work through as many as I can read,
Sure.
but maybe there'll be some time for questions as well. And then what I'll do is I'll package up everything, and maybe I'll spend a little bit of time showing how to open those in Charticulator and have a look,
Yep.
so that people can start building their own.
And
But
like
what
we
I want
talked
to try
about
and do,
before, I'm the 10 p.m. thing, or so the 1 hour thing is very loose. So if we go like 15 or 20 over, that's totally fine. And we've also discussed like if you ever want to come back on and do a part two, more than happy to do that. And I'm sure the people in the group would also love that as well. So
yeah, this thing is so extensible. We could talk for hours. Anyway, so what I'll do is I'll take the process of working through these examples as much as I can, and I'll start with the finished recipe because we don't have time to kind of build it out exactly as it looks, but we're going to go over some concepts. And that's the key thing with Charticulator is concepts. A lot of what turns people off is it's hard to kind of get that mental model in place. And what I want to try and do is show some basics so that you can start thinking in Charticulator and what that actually means. So the examples are very simple because once you get that right, you can start building on it. So we'll start with a simple scatter plot. And what I'm actually doing is I'm starting with it in Power BI so you can see that it is possible and it comes in. So this visual here is a Charticulator visual that I've exported already. And we've got an axis here for temperature and an axis here for year. And we've got a color for city in New Zealand. I've got a slicer at the top just to show you that some of the challenges in the past have been that it doesn't quite respond well to changes in data, but we can see that this is a version 2 visual, and it's responding quite nicely. As I slice and dice, my axes change according to the ranges of the data, which is perfect. Now with Charticulator, it's a separate application. So what that means is we have to get our data into it. So what I've done with every example is I've got a table on the left here, which shows the data for export that I need. And I use a table, and on the right-hand side, is this clear enough, or do you need me to zoom in on anything?
so it's pretty clear for me, and mine's also like a quarter of my screen because I'm doing all these other things. So I think it's going to be coming through pretty well.
Okay.
You have a fairly good Windows resolution set, so it's not like a drop in the corner.
Awesome. No, I'm very fastidious because this is like a 43-inch screen
Oh
at
yeah,
4K,
yeah.
but I downscale it and make sure I log in and out so that everything scales properly.
That
But
that's the
you know
that's the
how
word
it
that I
is. You
was thinking
kind
of.
of
Yeah, the scaling. I do the same thing. I
yeah.
I put it up to like 150, 175 usually whenever I'm doing presentations because otherwise people are like, why is your oh yeah, I forgot. Like you're on a 27-inch. I'm on a 42-inch TV. Okay,
Yeah, but anyway, just yell out if anything's not clear, and I'll zoom in.
gonna do.
But we have the fields that we want. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to have location is my kind of series. My calendar year, which is actually a date field, is on the x-axis, and the average temperature is on the y-axis. So I've created a table of location, year, and temperature, and this is one row per location, per year, per temperature. So the first thing I would want to do is get that data in. So with a table, the beautiful thing about that is I can export that. So I'll export that to a CSV, and I've done these already, just to save time. So what I would typically do is I would just call that NZ temp data, make a CSV file, and what I would then do is move over to Charticulator, and let's start with the landing page. So we'll reload this so that we're walking into it. So we have the new page here, and we've got the ability to add data and an additional set for links. Now, we're not going to focus on this, but some of the examples show some really cool visuals where, it's got like the character interactions between people in Les Miserables, and that's done using 2 data sets. But we'll focus on this one for now. So we click on we can drag a file to it, or we can click on it. So that's the wrong place. I want that one. So this is the file we just exported. I promise you this one is the same, but I like to stick to the script. So what happens is we get a little preview of our data. We can see that it's classed location as a string, it's classed calendar year as a date, and average temperature as a number. It only really has 3 types. And, whoops.
It actually reminds me a lot of like if you create like a live data set in Power BI, like it basically gives you the same options: number, date, or string.
Yeah, and that often ties down to charts and to Cartesian charts and things like that in general. Typically only really have a concept of a linear scale, an ordinal or nominal, so a categorical scale, or a temporal scale. I mean, there's other kinds of scales, but they're the 3 kind of major ones. So a temporal one being date, linear being numbers, and ordinal or nominal being string. So that's typically how Charticulator works. Now, it's got 741 more rows. What I would recommend is trying to keep your designs below 1,000. It will work with the custom visual limit of 30,000, but it becomes very, very slow. And the reason for that is much like when you create visuals in Power BI and you add a lot of them to the canvas, each one of those visuals is its own kind of query, its own little application, as it were. With Charticulator, everything you add to the canvas has its own logic. So it becomes quite tricky when you've got thousands of data points flying around the screen because it's got to compute everything. When it's compiled down, it's not so bad, but there are still some challenges. But again, the trade-off between rolling up your sleeves and building a visual from scratch versus using a tool to help you out. We can work pretty well with this number of rows, so we'll add this in. So first things first, Charticulator has what it calls a plot segment. So a plot segment is used for laying out your data. It also has the concept of what's called a glyph. And the glyph is probably the most important thing to think of. So a glyph is, if we just pull, we've got this little ellipsis here, we've got our data, and a glyph represents a row. So a glyph is Auckland 1966 0101 14.68, and then another glyph will be Auckland 1967 0101. So with Charticulator, you start with what's known as a glyph, and that represents one row of your data. So you have to think about the data you add to Charticulator versus the data you're going to visualize in Power BI. Each row of your data is a glyph.
Yep. It reminds me of a very similar transition when, like, I mean, well, now most people understand like visuals these days, but years ago, like back when reports were Excel pivot tables and visuals weren't used nearly as much, like it was a similar translation. Like this row of data is now this column. So like basically everything you see here is a shape. Like these rows turn into some type of shape. Same thing with glyphs is, a glyph is basically representing a shape of your data, and that shape usually is a row, so to speak, in that summarized underlying data set. Like Power BI does the same thing, in the back end. Like there's a table that's supplying each shape that's on the page, whether or not it's bars, rows, lines, circles, etc.
That's right. So we have the glyph editor here. And what we need to do with a glyph, to visualize a glyph, is we add what are called marks. So a mark is a shape or a piece of text or something that helps us to see that data. So what we're going to do is at the top here, we've got the ability to add, rectangle, circle, or triangle. These are more solid things. We have symbols, we have lines, we have text, and we have images or icons. So I'm going to start with a symbol because it's probably the easiest thing to work with. I'm going to drag this onto the glyph editor. And what's going to happen is all of a sudden our plot segment lights up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the title because that's something that you might use on a web visualization, but we don't need it in Power BI. And what we have around the side here are what we call guides. So these things that highlight up are used to snap things. So much like in PowerPoint or Power BI, how you drag something to the halfway mark or the edge of the screen or relative to another visual. These are what guides are for. So we could use those guides to just drag and make some space. We don't need a lot of space around our visual, not yet anyway.
I did wish
So let's make it as big as
there
we
was an
can.
option where, like in if you resize things in like PowerPoint, if you hold, I think it's the control key, when you start to move one corner, it does it mirrors on both sides. It would, cause yeah, that's one of my things. And I'm sure you're
Yep,
similar with
doesn't
making
work.
custom visuals, but I'm very, very particular about wanting to make sure that like the pixels at the top would be the same at like, pixel spacing at the bottom. So sometimes I know I spend a little extra time like, wait, these are the same width, right? Because I haven't found an easy way to get them like exact other than eyeballing it. And
No, I've
eyeballing is
never
always
even
one of
thought
those
about
that
that.
just, it rubs me the wrong way just a little bit if I can't like just specify, 10 pixels. And you can't really because this is
Well,
a scaled unit, right? So,
you can
oh,
just
can you?
down
Okay.
here. There's a margin
Oh,
option
no.
here. So I
Okay.
dragged them
That's
out,
good.
but I don't like. I can change them all to 10.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
not
there you
bad,
go.
and that's something that should export into Power BI as well.
Perfect.
Anyway, what we see here is a little circle, and each circle represents a row. So there's 741 odd. I think it's
Okay.
741 plus 8, but either way, each one of these represents a piece of
Yeah.
data. Now, this is laid out in what we call a plot segment. Now, plot segments are two-dimensional or a single line. And so this is ideally what we want is a Cartesian chart. So we have two dimensions, x and y, but what we have here is a layout that says it's laid out as a grid. We have the option to overlap, which is not that exciting because it's just going to be all those dots laid on top of each other. We can stack them along the x-axis, which puts them all along here. So what we have the ability to do is if we don't bind things to each side, we can actually do some pretty smart stuff. And we might see a little bit more of that later. Packing's kind of cool because it just clusters everything around, and it probably killed my browser, but it clusters everything around a point. So this is almost like a force direction type graph. So you can do some pretty smart things with this if you
Yeah.
have visuals that do clustering. And you have like maybe a grid. You can actually cluster pieces of so that the mushroom data set's a good example where it's got very maybe 2 by 2 categories, and you can put everything into quadrants. Maybe you could do that with a Gartner quadrant. I don't know. Who knows? Topical news.
Right.
Anyway, let's move it back to grid for now, which is the default. We also have scaffolds, and scaffolds dictate how things should be laid out. So we can have horizontal scaffold, we can have a vertical scaffold or a polar, which is a circular layout, and a freeform one, which is just bonkers. But anyway, we won't worry too much about those for today. But you can change the way data is laid out as well within this segment. What we want to think about is our scatter plot is going to want to put the glyph on an X by Y. So this plot segment, what we think about is we want to have our calendar year, which is our date, along the x-axis. So if we drag this out, you can see Charticulator highlights for us places we can add this. I'm going to put this on the x-axis. And what it's done is it's done almost that stack X layout that we saw for us. It's actually said, this now defines how the glyphs are laid out. So for every glyph, its position now relates to the value of date, which is just like a Cartesian chart. I think the key difference here is you've got to think that it's not necessarily always an axis, but we'll show that in a moment. With stuff like this, it's quite nice, which is why it's a nice intro. Now, average temperature is our measure or Y value. So what we can do is we can drag this across to the Y axis and pop that on. And we can see now that Charticulator works out the values from 8 to 18. And each glyph's X and Y position is now worked out based on year and temperature. So now we have something that looks quite nicely like a scatter plot. What I like to do is it creates some helpful names for us, but I actually like to sort of name these up so that there's something familiar. And the reason being is that when we get to Power BI, it's a bit more user-friendly.
Completely
Now, if we look
agreed.
at the actual glyph, we've got a symbol here, and we've got this little green dot which represents its anchor point. And I don't think it's going to show us, because what I'm going to do real quick, readers, I'm just going to drag this down so it's tiny, because this is like a one-to-one mapping of how the glyph looks on screen.
Yep. Okay.
And it's not doing that. So what I need to do is show the ranges of that. And what I might do is there's this little unpin button here that lets us undock it and resize it. And what I want to try
That's
and do is
nice.
show that a glyph has guides just like the plot segment does. And this little dot here is right bang in the middle. So what we can do with this is we can drag it to the right center, right top, right middle, left top, and it will reposition the glyph. And we can see that this does some weird stuff in the background.
Yeah.
With a symbol, we want to put it right in the middle of the glyph because that's essentially where we're positioning it. And I'll just move that back up. And because now you've made me aware of it, I'm going to make... Yeah, nah, this is it. So with the glyph, if we click on its mark, we then have attributes. So we can specify a different shape. So we can have a cross if we want. I'm going to keep it as a circle for now. We can change its size either by dragging a slider, which is probably going to look terrible, and it does. We could also, if we wanted to, bind this to a piece of data. So we could bind it to average temperature, which would perhaps not be the best thing to do visually. And what we see here is that expression that you were talking about. So there's an aggregate there, average, and then I've used the wrong zoom it hotkey. Hang on, there we go. So it does give us some UI type stuff where we can change the aggregate used. Because a glyph represents a single data point, and we're going down to the lowest grain, it doesn't really matter. But in Charticulator, you can aggregate data at a higher level, but we won't do that at the minute.
I want to say, like, that's actually really it's almost the exact same principles. Right now, Mike, a little bit. It's almost the same type of practice you would do in DAX. Like if you're, let's say you're calculating like the top N customer name, or just the top customer name. You could do a min, a max, or first or last. But because you're at the lowest level and you're only returning one set of data, regardless, the function, like you're just saying in here, doesn't really matter because either way, there's not multiple pieces of data being handed to it. It's one single data point. So any type of aggregation that's going to be done to it is still going to return the same number.
That's right.
For the scenarios that you would typically export to Power BI normally.
Yeah, I think if you do get into things where you aggregate your data in Charticulator, you have to remember that you need to put it into the visual the same way you put it into Charticulator.
Yes,
and let
exactly.
Charticulator figure it out. Anyway, so we have standard stuff down here. We've got a fill, and we can specify a color for that. Or what we can do is we can drag location. So we can either drag or click on the anchor, and we can drag location to fill. And that does some lovely coloring here, but we can now see that each data point has its own color based on location. Now, the size here is really not very good at all. So let's make that maybe 20. If we wanted to even further, we could add what's called a stroke to put a little black line around it or something similar, just to make each point stand out where it overlaps. I'll just leave that off for now. And what it's done, though, is it's created a scale here. And a scale is used to assign colors to each series. And what we can do with the scale is we can add a legend. So we can see that there are different colors, and in Charticulator we can see, but in our Power BI export, we might want to know what the colors mean. So Charticulator has this capability of building a legend, and it's automatically adjusted the guides for us. And what I might want is to be space efficient, because I've got this white space at the top here, but I still want my chart to work things out. What I can do is I can drag this across, much like I did with that mark, snap it to this guide here, and then I've got options to have alignment or orientation. And at the minute this is vertical, but I can change it to horizontal. And I can just drag that back across so that I've got the full canvas, but I've got my legend sitting inside the visual, which is a neat feature, and that's something that Power BI Core Visuals don't do, which is quite nice.
Yeah, so there's been a few times where I've wanted like not a separate section versus kind of just including it somewhere in the top and overlaying them, which is, it saves space.
It does indeed. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to rename that to, I'm going to call that legend. I'm going to type that without that horrible extra capital.
And this is a very similar best practice I'd even recommend, like within Power BI, like just if you add visuals onto the page, make sure they have friendly names in the selection pane, especially when you're layering and grouping. It makes it much easier to manage later on. You're like, wait, what is chart 1, 2, 3, and 4? Like you're not going to remember that.
No, that's right. Even the scale here that's assigned, I've gone back into the legend, and I'm just going to call that series. Now, the reason I'm calling that series is just because it groups anything that falls under that. So the fill, the color for that mark, but also the legend. These things are grouped together, which means that all the colors are assigned from the same pool. So it means that as long as this stuff is all nested, no matter how many marks you put on and how you bind that field, it will always be consistent across the visual, which is quite a nice feature. So this is as far as we're going to go with this one, because I want to get onto things like showing you how to actually make it work. So the first thing I would do is I would save the visual. And what saving will do is that will save that into your Charticulator session. And what it's worth pointing out is Charticulator runs in your local storage of your web browser. So what that means is if you're familiar with cookies, that's things that remember the site that you visited. So next time you come back to a site, there are some storage things that come back up and say, hey, this is your 8th visit, or I don't think cookies are even remotely that nice. But what this does is uses that storage to store your work. So I could just call, you're going to see others. All that's embed scatter. I'll put an O1 after it just to help clarify it. And I can save to my charts. And
two big caveats.
I'll
just say two big caveats with that is one, that means that it is only for that computer that you're on, because there's no login. And two, if you clear your browser history, you're screwed a little bit. So it's great for if you're just iterating through and you don't want to export 1,000 files as you're working through for the day. It's great to capture just as you're working through, and then eventually you can export a file itself.
Yeah, so this is something that I do a lot when I demonstrate Charticulator a lot. I don't want to accumulate loads and loads of charts between different sessions. So I'm always clearing my local browser cache.
Mm-hmm.
So you can lose those charts. So let me just open up the open dialog. And here's one I prepared earlier style. Here are all the ones I have in my local storage. Now this is the one we just created. So I can open that back up. But what I have is the ability, I can actually duplicate it so that if I want to keep this one as a reference, I can create new ones. But I also have the ability to download. So if I click download this chart, what that's going to do is it's going to, hopefully we can see that down there, it's going to export what's called a .chart file. And that's a Charticulator chart file. And I can actually use that on a different browser. So what I'm going to do is I'll package these up for you, Reed, is that all these charts here I've done this with. And you can import them into Charticulator by opening a chart. And if I go to my downloads folder, there's my chart. And
now,
I can just open that up.
I was talking to Mike about this, but apparently the old Charticulator used to include the data, but I thought one of the iterations, not the one that just came out, didn't include the data set with the export. You had to specify the data again when you import it. It looks like it includes it now for you, but
so this is one thing to bear in mind. Is that the data is embedded in the chart file.
Oh, it is, okay.
The reason being is that it's designed to be, if we look at Charticulator's primary use case, it's to build a visual that you're going to publish on the web. Now that data needs to stay somewhere. So if you want to work on that on another machine, that data has to get from one machine to another somehow. So this is something to bear in mind. If you produce a .chart file and you want to share it with somebody else, and you're using data from Power BI, you might want to make sure that data is generic or safe to share. So if you're putting all your financials in here and then you're like, hey, I did this cool chart, and you send it off to somebody else, you got to watch that. I wouldn't recommend it.
I'd say that's fair. I would assume though, and maybe on that, just on the idea of security, is so yes, if you were to copy and paste, into a flat file to use into here, be wary of who you'd share that to. But as far as just you using the tool, just as is, assuming you're not sharing it with anybody, let's say you have some kind of company sensitive data that you put in as you're building it. This is not being pushed out anywhere to the web. It's basically just rendering on your computer using the shell for the interactions. But there's no leakage or anything, I would assume, because I would figure some people probably would have a question about that.
Yeah, there is a privacy policy.
Perfect.
And there it is. It's on the new screen. So they have a privacy policy. So if you're using the online Charticulator, they collect telemetry. They don't collect the data. So there's some metadata there about the size of the data set and that kind of thing. And this is really just to help them understand how it's being used. Data is not sent up. And this is obviously, Microsoft to be in a little bit of trouble because this is a Microsoft tool. If you do not like the fact that they're doing that, you can download and build it locally, and that telemetry isn't used anywhere. So you have the ability to take the source code and build it on your machine, and the repository explains how that works. So you can actually do that and run your own version. And this is kind of like how the Power BI Tips guys got started. They built their own version of it, and they've made it available. So yes, they have a privacy policy here which states what they do, and they basically just collect some very simple information around how much it's being used, that your data is not used. It's stored on your machine. It's not sent up to Microsoft or anything like that.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yep. So the next thing we need to think about is we want to put this back into Power BI. So we can either do it from the menu. We've got an ability to export, or we can do it from this option here. And with Charticulator, if you were to check it out and build it yourself, by default, you just get these three options here, which are image, HTML, or template. So template actually strips out the data, but that's not really easy to import unless you're using what are called nested charts, and I wouldn't recommend using those in the latest version because they're just still a little flaky. They're good in the Power BI tips version, but they're still catching those up in this one. But then the bit we're interested in is the custom visual. So let's click on that. And we get a little preview, and we have what are called data mapping slots. So these are akin to buckets, field wells, data roles, whatever you want to call them in Power BI, bits where you put data. We have the ability to export certain things, and all these things will turn up in Power BI now. So previously, they've now got this thing called exposed objects, which exposes things that we can configure. And we've also got some extra stuff here for enabling drill down on certain columns and enabling highlight. So highlight is a feature that not every visual has, so we have to do some extra work to enable it. And highlight is when you click another visual and you want your visual to not filter the data. You want the data to remain but stay highlighted. So that's
I haven't.
Default, which is good.
So I had a question about that. I haven't tested it out yet, but in Power BI you can configure visual to either be cross highlight, cross filter. There's a choice for that. Is with this, do you have to make the choice here, or can you later go on and still choose what type of? Okay.
No, you can't. So the reason you can't do that is because custom visuals are their own little sandbox. And what that means for Power BI is when you build the visual, you have to give a list of things to Power BI that visual wants from Power BI. So highlight is one of the things that we have to tell Power BI our visual supports. So if we use this process to package the visual, we have to specify it here, because once the visual is in Power BI, we can't retroactively enable it because it's something that's part of that visual's metadata. It's not part of the configuration. So it's all about keeping the visual in Power BI as separate as possible. So the visual says to Power BI, I have things that I need you to give me. And Power BI says, cool, I know that, I'll give them to you. If highlight's not in there, it doesn't, Power BI is like, okay, cool, I don't have to worry about it. And it's all about the data that visual gets. It's all about keeping the data as separate as possible.
Got it.
So if we don't need highlights, it's less stuff to send to the visual. Highlights are expensive in the sense that it's technically a single query, but it provides more data because it has to provide the actual data and the amount of data you want to show.
It's you're doubling the data points essentially.
Yeah, you are. For every single data point in that visual, it has another corresponding value that says it's either on or off or part of it. So it just helps the work. Anyway, I'll just call this something real quick. I'll just call it scatterplot. And if you want to put your name to it, you can. And email doesn't get exposed, by the way. It's just part of the metadata. So you don't see this in Power BI if you share your visual. So I'll just leave it as anonymous. You can also now swap the icon out, which is a new feature. That needs to be a 20 by 20 pixel PNG, but we'll just leave that.
I really like that you can make your own icon now, because you can brand it to like a company logo or something else to make it feel a bit more like included, as it's part of the package.
That's absolutely right, and I've tested that works just fine. So it's a little bit fanciful for today. So back in Power BI, I'm just going to clone this tab just to prove that it works. And I'm going to import my visual. Obviously, I'm going to heed that warning. I do have a whole presentation about that warning, but it's definitely, it warrants about an hour's worth of discussion. So here's the visual that we exported. Let's click on that. And it now tells us it's imported. Now, one of the valuable things about the icon is that you could have it differentiate between all the other ones that are in here. But this one here is the one, this one is called scatter. So let's just add that. So we now get our visual. And this is the stuff that's exposed by that visual. So we have location, we have calendar year, we have average temperature, and we have tooltips. We also have what's called a primary key. And the reason for this is to enforce the level of detail in the visual. So what it means is if you build a visual in here and it doesn't match the data that you pass in, you can kind of force this. Now the good news is that this was a weirdly confusing thing in older versions of Charticulator, but now this isn't mandatory unless you need to override it. So we don't need to worry too much about it. So let's add in our location. Let's add in our calendar year. And let's add in our average temperature.
And I do like that it gives you that like little friendly warning, data set incomplete. Please, continue to add things. I didn't actually realize you didn't need the primary key. I always put something in there first. I don't know, just kind of like a top-down thing.
You always had to do that. They've now fixed it so that as long as this and anything you put in here matches the level of detail. Now, if I were not to put in, I don't have anything that changes the grain too dramatically, but if we needed to change it just gives you more control. So if I needed to, if location all of a sudden was less granular, but I still needed the same level of detail, this is where you'd add that in. But for now, it's quite good. It's more intuitive. You don't need to use it unless there's a good reason, which is nicer for newcomers. Because it's one of the weirdest things when you put it into Power BI. You're like, how the hell do I get this to work? Anyway, in the properties pane, we now have plot segment, data point, legend. These are all names that we typed in Charticulator. So if you want it to say plot segment 1, legend 1, go right ahead. But what's nice is, we can change the font family. You can see that's not good, but we can see it's all changing. Now, this is stuff you all used to have to do inside the app.
Yeah,
if you didn't like it, you had to rebuild it and start again. Now it's actually configurable, so we can change text color. So it's getting better. They're really pushing it forward.
I'm really happy that they added the level of formatting in here. Like you said, it's kind of a little painful sometimes to to have to make it in there, and you don't necessarily know how it scales. But because you can't update the chart, it adds a new chart. You have to actually create a new one any size, and you have to do again. So like the back and forth can be a bit tedious, and this just makes it. I feel like it really does shorten the length of the tweaking and tuning lifecycle.
Oh yeah, it really, really does. Which is good. And then the margins we talked about are all configurable as well. So one of the other things is that when you imported it and the margin wasn't quite right, you had to go back out and change it. But now you can actually fine tune it. But obviously the visuals are typically, they have an aspect ratio that should match what you did in Charticulator, but they're pretty good. They're responsible for resizing, responsive to resizing, that kind of thing. We've got...
Well, and that's the reason why those...
interactivity.
That's the reason why those guides are so important, because the guides make sure that
that's right.
Like you're at the 1/3 line, so that means that at any scale, I'm going to place this in a spot that is 1/3 the width or the height of your visual. So guides are. I think I've done a couple of times where I placed something that wasn't attached to a guide. I think it was on the screen, but then I resized it, and it doesn't scale correctly because I had this like subset of guides that was just in this one section, but it wasn't a guide for the whole page. Like there's a little bit of...
That's right.
There's definitely some times where I stumbled through and like, oh, okay, so I really need to have a guide that's the whole height of the visual or the whole width. If I start placing like small mini ones inside it starts to look a little wonky as I make things that don't look quite the same size as what it was like the Charticulator development.
Yeah, so a common thing is guides. Like here, what we've done is we've taken the plot segment and moved it off the guide. Now, I've resized that so it might be where I want, but because that's not snapped to anything, you get some really crazy stuff happening in Power BI. So this will actually make your visual resize in all kinds of ways you don't expect. What you might want to do, if you need, and I'm not going to get to them today, unfortunately, but if you need more guides, we actually have the ability to add them. So if I want a guide, I can just click it and make it happen. And I now get a guide coordinator here that goes across, so we can see that we have extra little pieces. And if I want to have really fine-tuning stuff, I can make 10, and now I can drag that across. And that will now work it out that it's 8/10 of the screen instead of some random position that it can't resolve. So it's quite cool. And the thing to remember is there are guides for the glyph and there are guides for the visual, and those are different.
Yep. And when you're
So
doing a
I am,
I'll just say like when you're doing a full screen visual like that, the guides like mostly just put it at full page. But once you start actually adding tons of little pieces, uh, I end up with like quite a few of those guides, both horizontally and vertically, to really make sure that again everything scales appropriately, and you know, like that you almost like live or die by them to a degree to make sure that that visual looks good at any level.
that's right. One thing actually that I used to use guides for was to try and produce grid lines. But one thing that you might not be aware of is that now you actually have grid lines
Oh, do you? Okay,
in version 2. We actually have grid lines, so we can
that's
add them.
nice.
It is. It's lovely. It makes a big, it makes a really big difference. So you know, we can see that on. If I go back to my original one, I've added grid lines for X and Y here. So you know that's a bit more easy to resolve visually. Yeah, I'm super conscious of time. So what I'm going to do is I've got a whole bunch of examples. I'm going to go to the bar chart
Okay, that's fine.
because bar charts are probably the next hard barrier to get over for people. So the scatter plot shows us how to position our glyphs. A bar chart's a little bit different. So I've got some data here, and I'm only going to use the average temperature from this one, but this is a much lower level of detail, much higher level of detail, higher grain. Auckland, Christchurch, Dunedin, there's no date in here. I've just got an average temperature. So if I go back across here, I'm just going to create a new visual. And bar data, there we go. So now I can see that I've got very simple data, add that in, and let's pop that glyph just to show you how much less we've got. That's a lot less. So we've got one row per city, basically. Standard boilerplate stuff. So I'm going to, because this is nominal data, so it's category data that doesn't really have an order, I'm going to drag location across to the y-axis, and that's going to position the glyphs where we think it should. Now, I want a bar chart, so instead of this, I'm going to drag on the rectangle. And we can see now that the glyph editor is expanded, and I've actually got bars that move all the way across. And based on what we've done so far, we might think, ooh, I'll take the average temperature and I'll drag it down here. And all of a sudden, this has gone really bizarre. The bars aren't doing what we want to do. And the reason is that because we've actually said position the glyph based on this value, which is a little bit different. So what it's done is it's put the bar, it's centered the bar on the data value. So bars kind of move all over the place, which isn't what we want. What we actually want to do is undo all that. And we have this little thing up here called the data axis, which is actually what we want to use to position or size, sorry, I should say not position, we want to size an element based on a data value. So we need to add this to the glyph, and I'm going to drag it all the way across. And I've now got a little blue line here which doesn't really have anything happening. I'm just going to give that a proper name because I'm going to leave that. You'll see the effect of these in a minute if I leave them alone. So if I drag the average temperature across, you see now on the glyph, we've got the ability to add a data axis. We've got height, we've got width.
Yep.
Now width could work, but we want to, it's best practice to use this because if we have multiple measures, we want to use the axis. Now, ignore this, but what's happened is that if I just biff the glyph out slightly, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that guide across so the glyph's nice and short. And I'll expand that out and I'll just make it a little bit bigger because it's quite difficult to see on the screen.
This is exactly how I made mine earlier too. Is like you'll see what you add data to a well kind of that's in here, but it will allow this bar to have variable height.
Yeah. So what's happened now is I've got this little blue dot here, which is the average temperature. And similarly, I could add the minimum temperature on here. And that now has minimum temperature. And I could add maximum temperature. And I've got these three little points. So I'm just using these for illustration just to show you that you can add multiple points along it. And now what I do is these effectively become guides of their own. So I can get the corner of the chart and I can drag it across. And you see now the little orange guide appears for the maximum. I get one for the average and one for the minimum. So if I drag that to average, and we can't see because I've made the chart small, I'll pin that back. And now we can see that our bars are all variable length. So let's push that out. And we can see now that and because I've got maximum on there, that's actually scaling the axis a little bit undesirably. So I'm just going to let's get rid of the maximum and minimum because we're not going to use those at the minute. That's interesting. Fun. Let's just recreate that. It's always fun when lessons don't go how you intend. Okay. Average temperature. There it is. And what happens is that you can often have measures that might cluster together, but what you can do is you can click on different glyphs and you can see that the value moves. So if you're having trouble snapping, you can find one that actually is in a position you want, and it tracks. Anyway, this data axis, I'm just going to leave that as it is. We're going to hide it. And I want some way for my readers to know what the value is. So I'm going to grab a text glyph and I'm going to position it on the end here. And you can see what it's done is anchored to that point as well. And we can see that each text label sits on the end. Text tools are great because we've got these anchors. So I'm actually going to center it and put it to the right. So it sits just inside the end of the bar. Likewise, I could make it left and it sits out on the end. And I can see here that I've got a little bit of overspill, so I can just change my, that's actually okay. With text, I can drag the field I want. So I can drag average temperature to, click on the text first, drag average temperature to text, and now I've got my values.
Like once
Now,
you kind of know the elements are and like where you need to drag and drop stuff,
yeah.
I will say that it takes a couple of hours to get used to, honestly, maybe, if you're really fast, like maybe an hour or so, but once you start to like understand the UI and everything else, like, oh yeah, okay, it's very clicky, draggy, droppy in a lot of senses, and it starts just to become a lot easier. Like the hardest one is with anything, building your first. The second and the third just very quickly start to become exponentially easier too.
That's right. So what we've got in here now is text has changed to say there's a little dollar brace thing. So this piece here is the expression, and then there's an extra piece here that says this is the format definition. So 0.1f is what we were talking about earlier about this is the kind of D3 syntax. So 0.1 is decimal point, one place, floating point number. So if we wanted to, we could make that a 2, and it would change the value to 2 digits. So these are just little things that take a little bit of exploration, but you can actually, if we wanted to, we could divide that average temperature by 100, as long as we keep it within the brace. There's little things we can do inside here. Simple arithmetic, that kind of thing works quite nicely. I'm gonna leave that as is. But what we can see now is we have a pretty simple bar chart. I'm gonna export that. Now it tries to be helpful because it assumes you're always working on the same visual. But you see now the exposed objects are plot segment 1, shape 1, data axis 1, text 1, and text 1 is going to be really useful when it comes to customizing, And we've now got a bar chart being exported. And again, I'll duplicate that one and delete the visual. That's where that was. Look into that. I was maintaining the visuals and it said that one's using 2 tiles. And I'm like, no, it isn't. But there it is.
Oh yeah, I do like that. At least when you delete a custom visual, like this is going to affect 18. I think they call them tiles, right?
Yes.
Okay. Officially, I just refer to them as kind of like objects, but the tiles on the page, yeah.
Yeah. So again, we've got location, we've got average temperature, and it works. So what's kind of cool now is that one thing we didn't have in the previous Charticulator, I should just point out, is in the plot segment, we have this auto range min and max, whereas before you used to have to specify the numbers. So one of the biggest complaints about Charticulator was it wasn't overly responsive to changes in data. So if I were to drag in, say, maximum instead, fingers crossed, obviously there's a slight formatting bug here, but that's because we added an extra decimal place. But we can see that the axis is scaling. Now, before it used to be within certain ranges based on the data that you were working with, so it was never that forgiving. But now you can actually produce a fairly generic bar chart that that will respond to certain changes that you perhaps didn't quite accommodate for in your design. The other thing is there's a tooltips field. So if we don't quite have anything showing up here, let me just drag that in there. I might not have enabled it. Yeah, I didn't enable it. So
Oh,
that's a new
okay.
feature that I should have thought about. So for each mark, we now have interactivity options. We've got tooltips, context menu, and selection. So I'm just going to enable tooltips.
Yeah, you used to be able to only
Save.
turn that on or off entirely for the visual, not individual
Yes.
points. So I do really appreciate the option to have only what you choose to, individual
Yes.
pieces of data.
It's very handy because then you can make things that perhaps you don't want people clicking on. You can turn off selection for those so that they don't guide people down the wrong path. So let me just add in my Mark II bar chart. Okay, and the cool thing is that this should work, is that I could just swap that over. No, it's really playing fun with me today. So tooltips normally does work. The thing to remember about tooltips, though, is it does support report page tooltips as well. But the field you want to use has to be in here, whereas with core visuals, it can be in any field well. So this is just a thing. A thing you have to bear in mind is if you want report page tooltips to work, you have to make sure, if we had location enabled, we have to make sure it's in here as well, just because that's how they build the visual. Really, really super conscious of time. But these are the kind of the two intro concepts I wanted to cover. But what I'll do really quickly is just step through some other examples, and I'm going to package these up. So I've got a line chart, which is done by, it's the scatter plot. So if we open that scatter plot back up, and this is another thing where people struggle is they assume you want to use a line. Actually, what you have to do is link the glyphs together. So what we actually do is there's this thing here called link, and we link using a line, and we link it by location, and we create links. And now we've got each link joined to each glyph is linked by a line. And what we might want to do is, if we don't like pointers on there, is we might go back and we might change the fill of the actual mark. We might actually change that to none. So you can see now that it's actually just more like a line. But what you got to think about is you still have to put the glyphs in the visual, but it's how you join them up to make a line. So that one I have packaged up. Bar chart we've just seen. One of the more fun things is producing stuff that, we've done line and bar charts, but actually producing something like a dumbbell chart. So that data set that we had, we used the bar chart to put a data axis on and position things. This was actually a similar trick we used with those three measures. I actually produced a dumbbell chart using those three measures. So, and I've colored those for minimum and maximum, and I've put the average in here with labels. I'm going to open that up rather than build it from scratch, just so that we can spend some time, just dig into it a bit more. So the way this works is I've got it, like you said, Reed, you use guides a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to drag that down so it's a bit easier to read. I use a lot of guides here horizontally to position the text and the marks and everything else.
Yeah, that also just shows you can add guides to the glyph or to the I'm going to say the canvas, but that's not the right word for the larger box.
No. You can add guides, but it gets a bit tricky. Yep. I generally tend to try and keep them inside the glyph, but we can see this is the minimum, the average, and the maximum, and I've got a min value text box and a min point mark, and I've got the same for average. So you've got to think about, with measures, you have to prescribe where everything goes. So I've got this really nice kind of custom dumbbell, which has, I can click on the line and it will cross filter, which is quite cool. But what I can do with that design as well is I've produced a version that's almost like a small multiples. So I've taken the same design, and what you can do, because this design, if we roll that out, the plot segment, because we're using a category axis, it has the ability to allow us, these things we looked at earlier, overlap, stack, grid, packing. If I click grid, it's not going to work. Why is that not going to work? I'm just
not changing it. Okay.
It's not changing it how I like, because I think it's how I've prescribed the width.
Mm-hmm.
So let's open that one up. So this is the same visual, just with a slightly different plot segment. So it's got a grid, and I think it's the direction that I set out incorrectly. So you can actually specify like a Z order or X order, go across or start vertically. So I can change the reading order if I want, which is quite handy. But again, this is exactly the same. I should have really opened that under the tab, but this is almost exactly the same glyph, just with a mark around it for the small multiple. and I've put the category inside. I know what it is. I just realized what it is. If we go back to the dumbbell, it's because we've got it laid out here. We need to get the plot segment. We need to turn off the y-axis and then make it a grid. There we go. So we're actually doing the layout here instead of along the y-axis. We were specifying everything go along the chart. We needed to turn that off. But then what I could do is I could whack my text in and I could just drag the location to that. And I've now got a title, that kind of thing. The other thing is, what's kind of cool is, I'll just show you the Power BI version of that. First is, this is what's known as a dot dash plot.
No, so let's do one more like example and then flip over to some questions.
Okay. So this is actually quite cool because it's using multiple charts inside the same visual. This is a scatter plot with a distribution plot along the side, because it's often quite hard to resolve these by color, but we can see the distribution of each city in its own little column. And just to prove that that's actually doing its own thing, if I start recording and I refresh the visuals, that dot dash plot there is a single query, but it's actually producing a plot here and a plot here. And that's one of the cool things about when you start getting into these custom visual type designs, is you can actually start prescribing your own layouts. So the way I might do that is I've got it prepared, but I'll just quickly dig it up. If we start with that same data we used for the scatter plot, now we might start with, we've got our plot segment here, so we'll just call that plot segment dot. And I'll do that in exactly the same way. I've got a scatter plot, I've got a calendar year, and I've got a temperature. And I'll put my location on the felt, and I'll just change that to call it series, and symbol 1, we'll just call that dot. So now we've got pretty much what we saw before. What's really neat now is that with the same data, let's add some guides in. And I'll maybe make that 10 just for simplicity's sake. Let's drag this plot segment across so it's maybe here. And I'm just going to call that glyph something else as well. So the cool thing is that you can actually have multiple glyphs. So I can add a new glyph, but it needs a plot segment. So I'm going to add a new plot segment here. And with that plot segment, so we'll call that plot segment dash, and we'll call that glyph dash. What we can do with this is we can then put location on the x-axis. And if we drag a simple symbol across, and we put average temperature on the y-axis, we can now see that we have a separate scatter plot that's independent of this one. Now that's not particularly exciting, so let's get a line.
Okay.
Put that across there. And let's delete that just to remove it. And now we've got a strip plot, but it's in the same visual.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah,
what I might do is turn that plot segment, I might go to here and turn off the y-axis. So, because we've got a shared axis now. And with the line, what's really cool is we talked about that scale. If I drag a location across and assign it to stroke, which is the line color, you can see that it's grouped under the series. So it's using the same color and it's automatically managing both. And then if I wanted to add that legend again, I can just add that in. And again, that legend goes underneath the same thing. So I can pretty much just do the same thing over here, move the legend across, align it that way, and just give us the space back.
Awesome. Yeah.
And what I might want to do is, obviously this is a bit superfluous down here. So I'll just hide that as well. And now I've got a bit more room, so I can just drag that down. And now I've essentially got one visual, as it were, with multiple actual visualizations in it that use the same data. And this could be, this data could be aggregated. It could be something else entirely. I just like the context of a dot dash plot, which is quite handy, particularly when you've got, if you need this color series in here. I mean, I'd choose different colors normally, because this is perhaps not best visualization practice to just use this palette, but I'm just going for speed here.
Yeah, and it shows not it shows the distribution, but also essentially the scale too, which is really nice, or the bands in that sense.
Yeah, and the links themselves are quite good because you can actually use them to make connected scatter plots, for example. So here's a good example from the New York Times. This is a fairly famous chart within the visualization industry where they show the evolution of gas prices over time versus how far we drive. And you can see this scatter plot actually tells us a little story about how, you know, miles driven per capita versus the price of gasoline. That's pretty easy to do as well. So we can actually just, I've pre-canned. So if I have that data set here, you know, I can just as easily set up a scatter plot. So I've got my price of gasoline, I've got my miles, I've got my normal scatter plot, and then I can actually just link those together by year. No, that's changed. It needs to be a date field now. But anyway, that's kind of anticlimactic, but it would produce a connected scatter plot. Anyway, I should have really just stopped while I was ahead.
No,
yes, I'm
again,
really running over.
yeah, it's fine. These things, 100%. I think we can also, this is a great introduction one. I think it would be fun to also do like a follow-up kind of, almost like what would it look like, not just to build a couple, one that can take 5 minutes versus maybe even one that's like what would a highly customized one look like, or one of the ones that have like the circular or any of those other fun ones.
Yeah,
But
circular ones are really good fun.
yeah, exactly.
Let me just while we're talking, I will just dig something out. But yeah,
yeah, and I'll field a couple of questions to you. So let's see. I'll go ahead and pop one into here. This was early on.
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, let's just do this one. One from Gopa. So how can you have one category and two values and have both the value, axis, scales, and sync? So that reading that, I'm almost thinking like a custom visual a little bit. In
How can we have one category and two values and have both the value, axis, scale, and sync? I think. Are you intending to have the same shared value axis or different value axes? Both are possible, but the way you would do it is using multiple plot segments and overlay them over the top of each other. So I have,
Yep.
and I cannot find it, is I actually have an example of a, oh, here they are. Just trying to dig them out. Charticulator. I have a parallel coordinate plot that I've got a synced version and an unsynced version where I've got multiple scales on the same plot segment, on this different plot segments, but overlaid. So you've got this parallel coordinate plot where things have different y-axes, and I've got a synced one. But typically the way I would do it is if I'm trying to use this shared axis, I would use the data axis approach that I showed you with the bar chart or the dumbbell chart. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so.
But if there's any further elaboration required, I'm quite happy for if Gopa wants to forward on a requirement or maybe post it on the Power BI community, I'm quite happy to take a look at it.
Okay, perfect. Chewy had a really interesting one as well. It wasn't directly related to Charticulator, but I think it's a great question about your custom HTML custom visual.
Oh, okay. I have a lot of people ask me about it. I provide them with actually, so this could be a PSA announcement actually. Let's just, so it's not on the app source page, but there's actually a website now, htmlcontent.com, which actually I've documented the visual and I've got a whole bunch of stuff around the privacy policy. And I've got a few frequently asked questions around, whether the visual is going to be certified and things about what does and doesn't work. Personally, any company that has written to me to ask me about security concerns, I have replied with information similar to this. The thing with HTML content is the issue of data leakage, as it were, is entirely in the hands of the author. So if you were to write an endpoint that could funnel data off that you pass into the visual, that's not on me, that's on you. And you can actually do that with DAX anyway. I don't know if you've seen the Power BI Pixel, which is something that I think Gil Raviv put together, which is quite a good use of showing how to use Power Automate to track usage within Power BI. That's
Yep.
probably the same thing. Da, 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 I would say if my hands are kind of tied with certification on this one, because one of the things we're not allowed to do is we can't dynamically change the inside of a visual using user input, and that's kind of the whole point of the visual. So
Yeah.
there is a certified HTML visual called, I think it's Shielded HTML Viewer, which is by, I think it's Nova Silver, and that lets you use HTML in a certified environment, but it's a very, very small subset of HTML. It's things like text and bullet points and things like that. It's not advanced content. So the trade-off is if you want a certified visual that does HTML, it's very, very tightly federated and you don't get as much flexibility. If you need flexibility to render most stuff, it won't be certified under the current rules.
Okay. I think that's
Believe me,
like
I
you,
try.
yeah.
I have regular catch-ups with the team to see if there's any way I can do it, and at the minute I
Yep.
can't.
But yeah, I
It's
think
just
you at
not going
least
to
have a
happen.
lot of transparency for what's done, and then what will what limitations there are, but at least you need to know that there's no like data leakage happening.
Yeah, certainly not from my side. I provide a means to allow you to put HTML in. I don't send anything out, but if somebody wrote something that pinged an endpoint that was enabled for it, and it has to be really specific situation. And again, I have a presentation on how there's a lot of misconceptions around the security of custom visuals. They're actually pretty secure. It's just more about what somebody could do with code inside that visual and if they crafted the right situation. This is why we have privacy policies and reputations to maintain. No one in their right mind would do that, but it is possible.
That's fair. I got another
Yeah,
good
it's
one.
it's a tricky balancing act, unfortunately.
Here's another good one from Excel Recalc or Die. Can I be asked how much on average do you ask for a payment to build a custom chart? I mean, I'll always say like
the
when you just ask of how much does it take to build, I would hope you would also have similarly. It depends until you have more information. You know?
it absolutely does depend. All I would say is, come on, Visual, don't let me down. Oh, I'm profiling. That's why. Ah, there it is. Contact me here or on Twitter or whatever. We'll have a chat. Visuals are entirely subjective. Um, Depending on what they want to do, how much you actually want to achieve, what functionality you want. If you want the full shebang, fully animated report page tooltips, cross filtering, selection, all the stuff, you're going to be spending a lot of money. What I would say is typically, if you were to look at consulting services on AppSource for high complexity custom visuals, I can usually undercut that by quite a lot. But you're still talking a decent amount of money.
Yep.
But it does depend. We have to have a chat about what you actually want to achieve. It depends on the data. It depends whether it's possible.
Yeah.
Charticulator is a low cost option, so I'm quite happy to consult on building a visual in Charticulator, which is usually quite a quick way to do it, and it lets you take control of customization later on.
That's
Um,
1,000% the easiest implementation for a custom visual. It's like, all right, so maybe you spend, let's say, like 5 to 6 hours or something on that. Like, and for a very basic one, it shouldn't. I would certainly imagine, at least from the way I've used it, would not take over like a day. But then when you start at like requesting those things that I mentioned, where it's, oh, we want the, let's say, like the data label to dynamically disappear and all those other little like advanced tweaks, like, okay, well, that's going to be like probably 2 hours to figure that out. Like that's a 1 hour chain, and all that really adds up very quickly in build time. But for basic ones,
yeah,
yeah, Charticulator is a small percentage of the cost of paying like an actual company to from completely from scratch code wise to build a custom visual.
yeah. What I will say is, if you are attending the Global Power BI Summit in April, I'm doing a session on a visual that I'm calling Deneb at the minute, and I probably will call it Deneb, which is the ability to create visuals inside Power BI using JSON, using a tool called Vega Lite or Vega. So if you're familiar with Vega and Vega Lite, graphical grammar libraries, and the JSON used to build those, um, that's hopefully going to be coming very soon once I've got it all polished up. But you'll be able to do some things like that in there. So you'll be able to do conditional show hide, you'll be able to do various other stuff. So I'm producing some incredibly esoteric use cases.
Yeah.
And I would be extremely keen to preview that, but I'm just conscious of time. And I definitely wouldn't want to do a full walkthrough because it's not quite ready. But in terms of the output that can be produced, it's quite prolific.
I think
so that will give people. That's probably going to stop me from earning a lot of money, that one, but it's going to bring a lot of power into people that want to do a bit more inside Power BI, but don't want to go full code, but they're actually happy with configuration. So I would just say if you're coming to the Global Power BI Summit, tune into that one. That should be quite good fun. I'm looking forward to presenting that.
Oh, I'll definitely second that. I think it is. Yeah, it's going to provide a lot of empowerment.
Yeah, I think I'm quite excited about it. It's definitely a new way to do it. So yeah, we'll be able to see what people can produce. Would be quite fantastic. I made a chart that looked like the Power BI icon the other day, and it actually works. And it's awful, and it should never ever be.
That one was fun.
Never see the light of day, but it was quite good fun just to see what's possible. So we can prescribe a lot, and that Vega and Vega Lite are really good libraries, and they give a lot of power to people to produce really powerful visuals with a lot of simplicity.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this was a great introduction to Charticulator, and we managed to cover quite a lot. I think certainly the people tuning in, I think we had a peak of about it was like 38 that were in at any point. And yeah, I certainly learned some, and I would think there's a really good opportunity to even bring you back on, and again maybe dive a bit further into some other features, already building upon the fact that we've done the initial walkthrough, and now that if they need that, they can just watch kind of the first video for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we didn't produce anything like amazingly esoteric, but I think it's important to understand the core parts of it, the building blocks, and then you can start to figure those things out. But I'm really happy to, I have some quite complex designs that I'm quite happy to bring back and illustrate. As long as with the prerequisite that you've seen the first video.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can absolutely show you how to build something completely, let's say mind blowing, but it will certainly pop. That's for sure.
Awesome.
But what's important with visualization is it's not just about how pretty it is; it's about actually communicating the data properly. And it's very tempting to produce something that's really, really fluffy, but it doesn't really do much. So that's the trade-off you've got with, the thing with core visuals is that they guide you down a path that's quite well established. When you get into custom visuals, that's the other pitfall, is that you can start building something that perhaps doesn't tell the story. And that's what we're really doing. We're surfacing that data, making it easy for our users to understand.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's like for the times where it's needed, there's just no replacement for building one of those custom visuals. And I think this was some great examples of just some of those unique use cases we have as well. So for everybody tuning in, I think for sake of time, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. But there's Daniel's contact info is down below, so you will be able to reach out to him. And I'll also, here in a little bit, once he gives me the files, I'll make sure that the description has all the links under there. You'll find that on my blog files page. But otherwise, yeah, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I actually have a new outro video today to play, so that will actually spit up right after this. But Daniel, before we head off, anything that you want to say?
Just thank you so much for having me. It's always really good to show some of the newer options or the different ways of doing things, and I really appreciate everybody tuning in and spending your time with me. It's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, Reid. Really appreciate it. And yeah, if you're happy to have me back, I'd love to come back another day.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll 100% have you back. So everyone, you'll get a round 2 of Charticulator sometime later this year.
Awesome.
All right, cheers.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships as well. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on social media to help pass on this awesome content and to help the channel grow. So until next time.